Okay, welcome back to U.S. History lecture videos. I'm Mrs. Richardson. Today we're going to be covering a couple of lessons. Challenges of Western settlement and making a living in golden cattle. So continuing to talk about the mid to late 19th century western part of the United States. By the end of today's lesson, you should be able to identify the major discoveries and developments in Western gold, silver, and copper mining, and explain why the cattle industry was paramount to the development of the West and eventually became the catalyst for violent range wars. So we've been talking about Western settlement for a little bit, and today we're going to focus on a couple of different sections, specifically gold, silver, and copper mining. We're going to kind of briefly talk about that, and then we're going to spend a chunk of time talking about the cattle industry. So as a reminder, settlers moved west after the Homestead Act of 1862 and faced many new difficulties in settling in the western lands. Today we're going to talk about the challenges of frontier farming and frontier cattle raising, or cattle farming, however you want to talk about it. All right. So as settlers and homesteaders moved westward to improve the land given to them through the Homestead Act, they faced difficult and often insurmountable challenges. Okay, the land was difficult to farm. There were often few building materials, harsh weather, insects, and often inexperienced people. Prices charged by the first railroad lines made it expensive to ship crops to the market or have goods sent out. So many small farms failed, while many survived and grew into large, quote, bonanza farms that hired additional labor and were able to benefit from the economies enough to grow profitably. Still, small family farms and the settlers who worked them were hard-pressed to do more than scrape out a living in an unforgiving environment with violent weather shifts. Now, you have to remember that when we're talking about this section of our lessons, the western part of the United States is physically huge, and there were a wide variety of climates that people experienced. And so we're just kind of talking big picture overview when we're talking about today's kind of concepts. Okay, so overall, land was difficult to farm. There were few building materials available depending on where you went, especially if you were in the Great Plains area. How are you going to, find wood to build a barn or build a house or have fire to burn, wood to burn in the fireplace to keep you warm that winter? They also experienced harsh and extreme weather conditions. Remember, the Midwest is known for winds, sudden weather shifts, tornadoes, really heavy rains, not enough rain, right? Insect infestations. Like, there's a lot going on. So you can just take a minute and just imagine what natural obstacles were the most challenging, depending on where people were. Okay? So the harsh frontier environment. The first houses built by Western settlers were typically made of mud and sod with thatch roofs, as there was little timber for building. You can see an example in this photo here. Rain, when it arrived, presented constant problems for people living in these houses, with mud falling into food and vermin, most notably lice, scampering across the bedding. I mean, if you live in the dirt, you probably have insects. Farmers also faced the ever-present threat of debt and farm foreclosures by the banks, while the land was essentially free under the Homestead Act, right? Everything else that you needed to farm cost money and were often difficult to obtain in these newly settled parts of the countries. Market economies did not fully reach this area yet, so things like horses, livestock, cows, chickens, pigs, wagons, wells for fresh water, fencing materials, seeds, and fertilizer, as well as farm tools, were critical to survival and difficult to find, right? You couldn't necessarily just create them out of the landscape. And so you had to purchase them after they were either brought by yourself or transported by somebody else from the eastern part of the United States, where these were either bred if they're animals or physically made if we're talking about wagons and fencing materials and things like that. So while the government incentives motivated many people to move out west, once they got there, for many people it was a lot harder than they initially thought, and often more expensive. And many people had used up a lot of their money getting there. Even if you had sold the majority of what you owned back on the East Coast, The further west you went, the more expensive it was for everything. I mean, the term highway robbery has multiple implications here, but for the sake of this lesson, just think having to pay, 5 times what something would cost on the East Coast, you have to pay 5 times more to get it on the West Coast. And so all of a sudden, supply and demand drastically affected the cost of materials. But you had to have it, because if you didn't have it, you couldn't farm and you were going to fail. Weather and insect challenges also directly affected those who were farming. There's typically low rainfall in the region, and so it was difficult to get enough water to the crops. There could be extreme temperature fluctuations, intense blizzards, but also tornadoes and intense summer heat and droughts. I have a friend who lives out in Illinois, and I think about the fact that her summers get extremely hot and her winters extremely cold. You could have negative 20 degrees, blizzards, and wind, but you could also have weeks of 95 degrees and humidity, and not enough water. So unpredictable weather obviously impacted crop yields. And there were, in fact, locust swarms. That's not a made up thing that we might think of when we hear about the Midwest. They could devour entire crops in a very, very short amount of time. And sometimes the locusts actually covered the ground for like 6 to 12 inches deep. So insects were a legitimate challenge for farmers. You could spend many months growing your crop only to have it devastated in a few days. Now, the railroads, as they grew and became more interconnected, eventually brought needed supplies. New farm machinery improved farming efficiency. Things like steel face plows and threshing machines were developed, and these inventions changed farming because people were able to farm more faster, and the more they could produce, theoretically, the more money they could make, until, of course, we swing in the other direction where there's an oversupply of farmed crops, but we'll get to that in a minute. So over, the time period between 1850 and getting closer to 1900, we see all these changes and advancements over those decades. So as we get closer to the 19th century or the 1900s, we see the rise of bonanza farms. I always want to say banana farms, banana, bonanza. These are very, very large commercial farms, often over 20,000 acres. They tended to hire migrant workers and heavily were located in Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota. Each year, hardworking farms produced ever more crops, flooding the markets and eventually driving prices down even further. Although some farmers understood the economics of supply and demand, none could control such forces. And so, as the decades went by and everybody was farming, there actually became an oversupply of what they were growing, and therefore it was harder to sell for the same amount of money, per bushel or per acre. And with the rise of bonanza farms and more technological advancements in farming, you were able to produce more crops faster. And so the larger farms who were able to make enough of a profit to invest that profit in more like mechanical equipment to help them just sort of cycled upward really quickly and left the small farms struggling and behind. So ultimately, many people really succeeded out west and changed the course of the lives of themselves and their future descendants. However, a lot of people struggled, right? It was a risk. It was a huge risk, and it did not pay off for everybody. All right, so moving into the second section, California Gold Rush. Gold mining and cattle. Not everybody who went to the West farmed. In 1848, there was a discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill in California. Of course, the person who discovered it tried to keep it secret. That doesn't usually work with something like the discovery of gold. Everybody leaks it. And also, in order to, confirm that your gold is gold, you have to bring it to get surveyed. And if you want to be able to turn that gold into the currency of the day, whatever coin or cash currency, you have to have someone exchange that for you. And so just by that process alone, news leaked out that gold had been discovered. Ultimately, this drew thousands of prospectors seeking quick riches. They were referred to as the 49ers. Using panning and sluice boxes, and this sudden, huge number of people affected California drastically. All right, thousands of people moved to California in a very short amount of time. There was a huge population growth. There were very quick development of mining towns that eventually became ghost towns. Some of them still exist in California today. You can drive around certain sections of California and see ghost towns because they would grow up in a matter of 5 years around a mining area. And when it was mined out, tapped out, sometimes people refer to tapped out, when there was no gold left, everybody packed up and left. And then, of course, the town is not able to stay alive without people living there, spending money, selling things, and buying things. And so these towns would pop up and then they would pop right down. But the physical buildings of the town remained and eventually became ghost towns. The California Gold Rush also had a tragic loss of life for Native Americans. They were massively discriminated against, specifically targeted in areas where people were trying to mine. Again, the vast majority of people who were mining saw the land as Americans and not Native Americans. And so, therefore, Native Americans needed to move. And if they didn't, well, they would face the consequences. And that was the mindset of many people who were involved in the gold rush. There was also, as you can imagine, with a huge population growth like that, very little like law and order. Thousands of people coming very, very quickly to a certain area did not always have the proper law enforcement staff to keep things under control. Beyond California, there was also silver and copper discovered during this time period. In 1859, the Comstock lode was discovered in Nevada, and that eventually yielded over $300 million in silver. There's copper mining taking place in Arizona and Montana. And so it wasn't just farming that drew people to the West. These discoveries of gold, copper, and silver created towns overnight and motivated even more people to move west. Many people moved west to mine, and even when that played out, stayed there and began to do other things. So, still permanently changed the landscape of the western United States. All right, and the last thing that I want to talk about today is cattle ranching. Look at this beautiful set of horns on this cow. Longhorn cattle. Now, the cattle kingdom. In addition to silver, copper, and gold and farming, the cattle industry transformed the West. This took place heavily in the southern part of the western United States just due to the physical landscape that longhorn cattle thrived in. So there were millions of longhorn cattle in Texas after the Civil War, and the development of railroads made it profitable to transport cattle east. And of course, you could keep the cattle alive on the train and then harvest or butcher them when they arrived in the East Coast as meat for the people living on the East Coast, of which there was a demand. Because remember, a lot more people on the East Coast than physical land to farm the food that they needed. So cattle drives became common in the 1860s and 70s, and which is where we get that sort of quintessential image of a cowboy, kind of a free range roamer, moving from farm to farm, picking up work as they can find it. Now, famous cattle trails from Texas to Kansas. Why was this necessary? Well, the vast majority of cattle were living in Texas, but the railroad did not necessarily go through Texas. And so the cattle had to be physically driven, walked, herded up to the closest or most beneficial railroad station where they could then be sold and transported east on cattle trains. So there are several famous trails that ended at cow towns like Dodge City, and then the cowboys would get paid and spend money, which of course affected these quote unquote cow towns over time. Most cowboys were in their 20s. About 1/3 of them were Hispanic or African American, and they borrowed very heavily from Mexican ranching culture. Remember that Texas was originally Mexican, and even after it became American, there was a lot of Mexican influence. sort of cross-cultural exchange between Texas and Mexico. And so there's a lot of Mexican culture that kind of leaked into Texan culture. Challenges that cowboys faced on the trail, right, could include very long physical days on the saddle, the risk of being trampled by these huge cows, being, herded by the hundreds or even the thousands. And it wasn't always the most reliable work. It was seasonal, it was temporary. Cattle drives did not need to take place constantly all year round. They happened at specific times of year. And so sometimes, as a cowboy, you'd have to continue to travel to continue to find employment. Now, what brought about the end of the cattle drives was the invention of barbed wire. In 1873, barbed wire was invented and was referred to as the devil's rope by Native Americans. It had a profound impact on the American West. Before its invention, settlers and ranchers were slowed down by a lack of building materials to fence off land. Having wooden fences built across hundreds or thousands of acres just wasn't something that most people could do. And so community grazing and long cattle drives were the norm. But with the invention of barbed wire, it became cheaper and much more doable for people to fence off their land. And as more and more land was fenced off, whether it was actually theirs to fence off or not, because that was often in question, it limited the ability of free range cattle and cattle drives, because you have to be able to drive your cattle across other people's land if you're going to, travel across 3 states. As with many other inventions, several people, quote, invented barbed wire around the same time. In 1873, it was Joseph Glidden who claimed the winning design and patented it. It spelled the end of the free range for settlers and cowboys and managed to keep, of course, more land away from native tribes. It is definitely seen as, again, quote, the devil's rope by Native Americans. Really brought about a forced, changed way of life for Native Americans that they didn't agree with. So overall, the Wild West was a bit wild. There was some myth and some reality to it. The Wild West was portrayed in books, television, as film as one of violence and mayhem. There was a lure of quick riches through mining or driving cattle. That meant that much of the West did indeed consist of rough men living a rough life, even though the violence was exaggerated and even sometimes glorified in dime store novels of the day. There were episodes of violence, and kind of a lack of law and order and the lack of staff to enforce that law and order. You're talking about a huge, just a physical space that the United States had to police. It was very hard to even track people down after a crime had been committed, just due to the lack of sheriffs, right? And it was such a dangerous job. Not everybody wanted to do it. One example of, sort of non-gun related violence that cropped up was actually the fence cutting war in Texas. In Clay County, Texas, cowboys began destroying fences that several ranchers had erected along public lands they had no right to enclose. As a result, confrontations between cowboys and armed guards hired by the ranchers resulted in 3 deaths. It was hardly considered a war, but got the governor's attention. And then there was a special session of the Texas legislature to address this problem by passing laws that outlawed fence cutting, so made it illegal to cut fences, but also forced ranchers to remove fences that were illegally erected along public lands. So they had to address that issue directly and specifically in Texas. So in the West, sporadic violence definitely did erupt, and when it did, it was often concentrated in mining towns or during range wars. Some mining towns were just as rough as the popular stereotype, right? Men, money, liquor, disappointment, saloons, all of the things. Fights were common, deaths were common, and quote unquote frontier justice reigned. There were some people who got away with shooting a dozen other men because there was no one there to enforce the law. So people definitely got away with things that they shouldn't have been able to get away with. And it took a lot of time for the United States to kind of catch up on enforcing law and order. Now, over time, the West became a bit tamer. Wealthy men brought their families west, and with the growth of families, women, and children came a little bit more law and order. So, for example, in Abilene, Kansas, which was known as quite a lawless town, wealthy men brought their families, um, and the town slowly transformed. This town in Kansas had prostitutes, gambling, and many other vices, drinking, and just chaos, right? And that was transformed when middle class women arrived with their cattle bearing husbands. These women did things like organizing churches, schools, civic clubs, community programs. They fought to remove opportunities for prostitution and shut down the saloons. And also during this time period, Protestant missionaries eventually joined the women in their efforts. And while not all problems were eradicated, they brought more attention to the problems of the West. And over time, they were slowly kind of addressed, and the West began to be quote unquote tamed. So that's where we're going to stop today.